PIAC is based in Australia, and I'm joining you from the land of the Bidjigal here in Bondi in Sydney. The Bidjigal are part of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to them as traditional owners of this land. This webinar marks the official launch of the PIAC and IICI guides on remote and restricted access interviewing. My colleague Emily Rice and I are the co-authors of the PIAC publication, Restricted Access Interviews, a guide to interviewing witnesses in remote human rights investigations. Our guide draws on PIAC's experience conducting remote investigations into the Sri Lankan Civil War, as well as extensive interviews with investigators from the UN and NGO. We've been very pleased to have developed this as a companion piece to the IICI guidelines on remote interviewing. IICI's, the co-host of this webinar, the Institute of International Criminal Investigations, and their shorter guide is based on the Institute's experience and that of their extensive network of global experts in criminal and human rights investigations. Many of you contributed to your expertise to these guides, and we're extremely grateful for all the input you gave us. After going through a few housekeeping points, I will briefly describe why we developed the guides, and following that, the Honourable Michael Kirby will provide an opening address. Erin, Gallagher, Mohamed, Kheir, and Shuvai and Nyoni will then engage in a panel discussion, and Philip Trewhitt will share some concluding remarks. I will introduce each of these experts before they speak. I have a few general points before we start. As you've seen, the session's being recorded, and we hope to share the recording on our respective websites. The question and answers window will remain open, and we encourage you to put questions in there for our speakers and panelists. We'll try to get to as many as we can after the panel discussion. Please do download and read our guides. The links to them are on our websites and will be posted in the chat shortly. Also next week, the IICI guide will be available in Arabic, Spanish, and French on their website. And finally, I'd like to just note that this webinar addresses remote and restricted access interviews of adults only. The highly specialised area of interviewing children will not be addressed today or tonight, wherever you are, and is not in our guide either. This webinar is focused on situations where human rights and criminal law investigators can't fully access the area or country under investigation. Specifically, we will discuss what investigators must consider when contemplating and conducting remote interviews. Should remote interviews be conducted at all? How will you find the witnesses? Can you find diverse witnesses remotely? There are questions about technology, like what devices and platforms to use or what to do if a connection cuts out. And there are lots of questions around physical and emotional safety that are crucial, like is an interview going to harm the witness, and how can that harm be mitigated? The questions go on, and they are ones that investigators are increasingly grappling with. More and more investigators are restricted from travelling to the sites of alleged violations. In fact, 2/3 of recent investigations by the UN have had restricted or almost no access at all. Similarly, non-government organisations are prevented from accessing conflict zones and can't move around freely to investigate potential war crimes and human rights abuses. In the past, access has been denied for political or security reasons, or sometimes budgetary constraints. But in the last 20 months or so, unsurprisingly, COVID-19 has created additional access barriers. This issue of no access or restricted access is not new, but it is increasing. And with the advent of technology, it has meant that remote interviews are being considered more and more. Despite this, it is an issue that until now has not benefited from clear public guidance. Both publications are intended to fill this gap and be practical resources for investigators. The idea is that it will help assist in decision-making for investigators, help them in obtaining high-quality information, and prioritise witness well-being and safety, and maximise the usefulness of an investigation's findings. Each context provides unique challenges for investigators that must be approached systematically. The main advice of PIAC and IICI guides are that remote interviews should only be undertaken after careful consideration. This includes developing remote interview-specific policies and plans informed by expert advice, including trauma and security experts. We hope to also illustrate the systematic approach to you today through the insights of the speakers and panelists. We thank you all for joining this session and being part of what we hope is the start of a more discussion on this topic and greater sharing of lessons learned. We are delighted to have the Honourable Michael Kirby, AC, CMG, former Judge of the High Court of Australia and one of Australia's most renowned legal thinkers and human rights champions, here with us. Most relevantly to today's discussion, Mr. Kirby was the former chair of the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the People's Republic of North Korea. The government of North Korea was hostile to the UN inquiry the entire time and remained uncooperative. We are honoured to have you here today, Mr. Kirby, to provide the opening address.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and I pay my respects to the Indigenous people of Australia all across our continental land, and remember the great wrongs that they have suffered and still suffer. I pay respects to my fellow panelists and also to PIAC for the innovative work that it has conducted in Sri Lanka, and the extension of that work that this webinar tonight is designed to symbolize. Looking at how you can actually collect information on often terrible, frightening, and disturbing circumstances of grave abuses of human rights. It's quite a challenge, and it was certainly a challenge that we faced in respect of the inquiry established by the Human Rights Council of the United Nations to investigate in 2013-14 the human rights violations in North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. This is the report that we produced, and the report details the issues of the methodology that we adopted. The three commissioners, Marzuki Darusman of Indonesia, Sonja Biserko from Serbia, and I gave a lot of thought to methodology. And at our very first meeting, we decided on a methodology which for the United Nations system was rather unusual. We called for witnesses to come forward. We mobilized civil society to bring witnesses forward. We offered to North Korea the opportunity of being represented before us. They ignored all our communications and devoted their time only to attacking us personally and as a commission of inquiry. But that didn't stop us any more than an inquiry or a court proceeding or other formal process will be stopped by the non-cooperation of those who are the subject of inquiry. What was unusual about the inquiry into North Korea was that we conducted it in a way drawing substantially on the Anglo-American tradition of public hearings, of giving the opportunity to those who had been the subject of cruel and violent and anti-human rights conduct to speak truth to power and to do so in public and where that was safe and to have their say in order that their voices would be heard and recorded and available. We placed them online. They are still online. They are available in all parts of the world, except in North Korea, where the internet is not available for ordinary citizens, except those who have close connection to the regime. The inquiry led to an amazing panoply of matters that were recorded. We followed the 9 items in the mandate that was given to us by the Human Rights Council. We took our report to the Council, which endorsed the report by a very strong vote. We took it to the General Assembly, and exceptionally, it went to the Security Council. Only once before had the Security Council brought onto its table the matters of human rights violations, in that case in Myanmar, Burma. And so that was the methodology that we adopted, and it was unusual and it wasn't necessarily suitable for all of the human rights investigations that are under consideration in this PIAC webinar tonight. I thank PIAC for extrapolating from the circumstances of particular inquiries. These inquiries must not just end up in a report. The United Nations has many corridors, and below the corridors are the deep dungeons in Geneva and in New York where these reports gather dust. It's important to make the reports speak to the people of the world in whose name the United Nations is established. And that was the endeavour of the Commission of Inquiry on North Korea. I hope that out of this dialogue tonight will come the resolution that we turn the investigations into crimes against humanity, into genocide, and into other international crimes, matters for the community of the world. Human rights belong to the people of the world. They preceded the United Nations, and they are there for us to respect, and where we can, transparently to reveal, and where we can, to bring them to accountability. And that is what this webinar tonight is about. And so I have great pleasure as somebody who took part in the gathering of information for the United Nations to attend, listen, and learn from the work of the Public Interest Advocacy Centre. I congratulate those who have put the webinar together, and I am looking forward to advancing the cause of human rights for people everywhere, which is the goal of the United Nations and should be the goal of all humankind.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kirby. I think the thing that particularly stood out to me, and which we'll hear now more from our panelists, is when you talk about the North Korea inquiry and you talk about the methodology being specifically tailored to that context and how it was unusual and not necessarily suitable for other contexts, but each context needs to develop that. And that's, I think, one of the key lessons we're seeing with remote interviewing is that it really needs to be done context specific in a way that supports witnesses as best as we possibly can and brings out the truth. I'll turn now to our three expert investigators that we have with us, who've all been part of the investigations that have considered remote interviews or had because of restricted access. While, as I said, I'll introduce each person before they speak, I just want to note that each of them is joining us in their personal capacity. During the course of this panel, what we'll do is we'll touch on the context where remote and restricted access interviews might occur, the planning involved, issues in conducting interviews and referral pathways. But there is a lot of material to cover. So I just want to reiterate that you really should download our guides and for a more detailed discussion of these topics, because we won't be able to cover everything, and there really is a lot of content. So first we have Mohamed Kheir. Mohamed is the lead investigator for the United Nations Independent Fact-Finding Mission on Libya. He has previously worked on a number of United Nations Human Rights Council mandated investigations, including Gaza, Syria, and Yemen. Mohamed, you've witnessed the challenges faced by investigators due to the changing security situation, hostile governments, COVID-19, and budgetary constraints. Could you tell us about the different types of access you've received across these investigations and how these have affected your ability to access witnesses and how you compensated for this lack of access?
First of all, good morning or good evening for those in Australia. Thank you very much for inviting me. And also I wanted to extend my regards to the other panelists, Judge Kirby, to Shuvai, and to Erin. Yes, no, your question is I think very relevant now, because we're seeing a proliferation of commissions of inquiry, not only by the United Nations, but also by civil society. We're seeing an increase also by local kind of citizen reporting. So I believe that these guides and these discussions can feed into the work of all of us. I am currently, as you mentioned, working with the fact-finding mission on Libya. And we're encountering many of these challenges. So in general, the range of access that I've experienced working with commissions went from quasi-ideal, so physical, in-person access to individuals and to the sites of the crimes, going down to physical, or in-person meetings, but in remote areas, in third countries, for example, as well as remote interviews on site and in third countries. Of course, from an investigative perspective, in an ideal world, we would have in-person access to witnesses and victims, as well as to the locations where the alleged violations have taken place, because it would allow us to verify to a higher standard the information that we gather, the allegations that we have gathered. But of course, the work of the UN commissions is guided by the do no harm principle. There is a specific methodology that is applied to most of the United Nations commissions of inquiry. They have to comply with kind of common standard. And to that extent, wherever we are in a situation that we have to do or we choose to do remote interviews, we have to first make a general assessment of the situation, and then an individual assessment before we meet with someone. The different kinds of reasons for doing remote interviews. The first among which, at least from my experience, was lack of access for political reasons. So either the official authorities or the de facto authorities that exercise control over the areas that we want to visit, in several occasions, simply refused to provide us access. So that's the first situation in which we would consider carrying out remote interviews. The second is, of course, when we do have access, but based on an assessment by our colleagues who are competent on matters of security, it is an assessment is made that an in-person visit could carry too high a risk to our interlocutors, whether they be victims and witnesses, as well as those intermediaries that are crucial in our work, because they are the ones who identify valuable witnesses and establish contact with them on our behalf. These may include United Nations, local presence, individual activists, NGOs, international or national. And there are, of course, other circumstances too, which compel us to consider remote interviewing. For example, most recently, the outbreak of COVID. In a context like Libya, for example, where we intended to, among other places, visit also detention centers, IDP camps, or areas where you have a high density of people living in a context that can, raise the risk of the spread of COVID, for example. There are also ethical questions involved for those of us who may be traveling from abroad and potentially carrying, a risk of infecting people there, and then it could degenerate into a very dangerous situation. So from my experience, it was never only one of these modalities, in person or remote, etc., but it was a combination. So for example, currently with the fact-finding mission on Libya, we have visited the country. We were given access to the country. We were unable to visit all of the country, but we also did a large number of remote interviews. There's a general assessment that is made concerning whether or not we have access, what is the security situation there, what is the capacity of those who could threaten witnesses and victims, what is their technological capacity, do they have the capacity to eavesdrop on certain types of communication, do they have the capacity to follow people, to spy people. An assessment is made based on a wide range of criteria. And then based on that assessment, we can then, reach a point where, for example, it can be established that it is reasonably safe to do remote interviews. Where we have a situation like that, an individual assessment is made, usually concerning the profile of the person we are going to be interviewing. So if, for example, we're going to interview somebody who is politically active, who is affiliated with an armed group or the other, who for one reason or another is more vulnerable to possible retaliation, then an assessment is made, usually not to interview the person remotely. So we have to, of course, raise the threshold for doing remote interviews. So there must be a very specific advantage sought from an investigative perspective. There must be underlying security conditions that would guarantee or that would allow us to believe that there is a reasonably safe context to do a remote interview. And there's also an element of ethics or transparency in which we have to explain very clearly to our interlocutors the risks that are implied by engaging with us, so that they can also make an informed decision as to whether or not to engage with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed. There was a lot there, and I think it's really helpful to hear about the different contexts, but also the fact that each assessment needs to be made on its own. So the general assessment you spoke about and the individualized assessment, and that's something we also go across quite a bit in our guides, because even if a context you think it's okay to do remote interviews, but seeing whether for the individual that makes sense as well. And it's clear as well from what you're saying that there's a considerable amount of flexibility required and very, very careful planning. This leads me into what I wanted to ask you, Erin. Erin Gallagher is a criminal investigator with the International Criminal Court. She's worked closely with IICI on the Murad Code and was previously the Director of Investigations for Physicians for Human Rights, documenting war crimes in Syria. Erin is a trainer and associate of IICI's and was one of the investigators PIAC interviewed for our guidelines. Erin, when Emily and I spoke to you for the guide, you raised the difficulty in ensuring witness diversity in remote settings, the challenges of working with intermediaries, vetting them and briefing them on witness selection. Would you be able to share with us in more detail some of the issues you've considered when planning remote interviews and what some of the preconditions that you've found are needed to be there in order to conduct them?
Thank you all. Thank you, PIAC and IICI for inviting me, and for a really two very thoughtful and comprehensive guidelines that you've put out. I'm a practitioner by trade, and just like any practitioner, any interviewer, we want to control the environment in an interview as much as possible. We want it to be safe. We want it to be private, uninterrupted, and comfortable for, the interviewee, for the witness, so they can talk freely. And I'll speak a lot about responsibility, because I think we have that as the interviewers, that responsibility, whether in person or remotely. And you might argue that perhaps we have it even more so remotely. I recognize that we all have different resources, different budgets, different technical capacity. So We're all going to have a different range of what we're able to do. But hopefully, as we talk about, these sort of these guidelines, these principles, we'll at least be able to make some very thoughtful and self-aware judgment calls when we decide to interview somebody. As Mohamed mentioned, and yourself, Daniela, that the selection of the witness is key, who we interview, but also part of that is who we leave out, and whether that's because they don't have the capacity for technology, for internet, for phones. Could it be because of their location, their remoteness, socioeconomic background? Could there be, gender, cultural barriers where, women and children might not have phones, or disabled? So just to be aware that, when we are selecting who we interview, we are really looking at those that have access, and we might be eliminating some very good potential witnesses, and therefore information as part of our investigation. The key for everything, as you mentioned, Daniela, is to understand the context, primarily the witness context, and prepare for everything and anything that can happen in a remote interview. We need to know the witness's environment. Whether are they living in a refugee camp? Are they living in an urban center with no privacy? Are they living in an extended family? Does the family know about their experience, especially if it were, let's say, sexual and gender-based violence? Do they have the freedom to speak, or do they even have any privacy and the technical capacity? Or do we need, as interviewers, need to conduct those interviews elsewhere in a more private, controlled setting? I think the one thing to keep in mind is we can't simply just pick up the phone and call somebody and expect that we can conduct an interview. That would really be irresponsible. And when we are doing remote interviews, we are going to more likely need to rely upon ground support, whether you're fortunate to have your own staff, those that work with you, that have field offices that are based in the ground that can help support you, great. Otherwise, you might need to rely upon intermediaries, those civil society organizations that may have helped you locate witnesses or victims, that might provide assistance or aid for witnesses, but you may need to heavily rely upon them for our remote interviews. And I'll get into that in just a little bit more in a moment. I would argue that you need experienced interviewers doing remote interviews. You don't have a lot of the tools that you typically have when you're in person, or the distractions. And a lot of it is going to be recognizing the cues, recognizing where there's distress or, other emotional barriers, and verbally being able to respond. And I think that takes being a pretty experienced investigator with those skills to be able to both read and respond appropriately. And before you start the interviews, not only choosing who your witnesses are, choosing who your interviewer is, but also having a standard approach of, whether it's protocols, guidelines, procedures within your organization, within your team, as to how you're going to conduct these interviews, how you're going to record them, how you will state your methodology in reports, but to have a standard approach. Back to the context of the witnesses, one of the primary issues of concern is their security. Where can they confidentially, comfortably speak to you. And once again, you may need the help of an intermediary to facilitate that, to even provide the venue, to provide the transport, perhaps, to provide the room, the setup, but that will be a more ideal situation where you do have that ground support. But it also means knowing your intermediaries, vetting them well, knowing that they are approaching witnesses with confidentiality, that they are explaining your mandate or the situation well, and that they're treating witnesses well. So it is important that we know our intermediaries within the context very well. And if we need interpreters, the same issue. We might have different scenarios where the interpreter may be on the ground and be a part of the interview with the witness, or they might be remote in a completely separate country. So still, we're going to need to have good interpreters that also can see the cues, can see any distress, and see the signs, working with witnesses as well. Back to in terms of the planning, along with the vetting of intermediaries, selection of intermediaries to assist is also the venue itself, of course, a private, quiet, comfortable place that has the technological capacity. Probably as you've all experienced so far in doing these interviews, there's probably a rare interview where you don't lose internet, you don't lose cell reception, the bandwidth is going in and out. Perhaps there's not enough phone credit or batteries are not charged. So all of that, has to be checked and run through beforehand before you practice it. Before you do it for real, and to have backup plans, which you explain as to what happens when you do lose the reception. What will be the second plan? Will you go to a phone? Will you, wait again? Will you reschedule? What have you? But you're going to have some backup plans, and not to forget. Also with COVID, we also have the backup for having safe and clean, masks, cleaning facilities, et cetera, during the course of the intermediaries. And let me wrap up quickly with the intermediaries, most importantly, that we have briefed them properly, that they completely understand what we need from them, what we need for them to be doing with the witnesses. And then most importantly is the psychological safety of our witnesses. Have we provided an emotionally safe environment for them to speak to us, both before the interview, of course, during the interview, as well as after? Do we have psychosocial support available that can be there with them? And if not, do we have somebody or an organization that is prepared to meet with them afterwards if and when we have caused distress during the interview? And have we properly vetted them as well and understand their work and who they assist? I'll leave it at that for now. Well, thank you for that question.
Great, thank you, Erin. You covered a lot, and it's incredibly interesting. One of the things that you were talking about was about the place where the interview actually occurs, and I think that that's a really interesting one, particularly in light of COVID, and also what Mohamed was saying around being careful as investigators, not wanting to create more risk for someone by bringing a disease to an area that obviously no one wants to do. And it's interesting because with that, a lot of people are conducting the interviews from their bedrooms or from their houses and talking about extremely traumatic events. And so the risk of contaminating a safe space for them was something I remember you raised when we spoke about the guide, but also for investigators who are conducting these interviews from their homes with COVID and working from home. But one of the things I wanted to also pick up on, which I wanted to turn to you, Shuvai, to ask more about was this idea of the kinds of witnesses that you're missing and what happens when you aren't conducting remote interviews. So Shuvai Nyoni is a gender advisor and investigator for sexual and gender-based violence as crimes in conflict, including on the UN Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, and serves on the UN Women Justice Rapid Response roster. Shuvai, you've been part of investigations that have spent a lot of time doing this planning that both Mohamed and Erin have spoken about. And in some cases, this has meant you've decided not to conduct remote interviews. I'm keen to hear more about when you've decided not to, the factors that led you to deciding this, but also what impact this had on your investigation and what this meant for the voices that you weren't able to hear and the stories that couldn't be told.
Thank you so much, Daniela, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone, especially my fellow panelists, Mohamed and Erin, and to you, Judge Kirby. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you today. And I think in answer to the question, I think first of all, just to say that I have been involved in investigations or documentation processes where generally the mechanism I've been working with has enjoyed access to the territory or to the country that is being investigated or where the documentation is taking place. And that I think puts a slightly different or helps us to look at this from a slightly different perspective. So the access there has been access. And I think secondly, that much of the work I have done has also been speaking to people, interacting with those who have been affected, victims, survivors, etc., quite soon after the violations have taken place or various events have taken place. So within 6 months or 12 months of what has taken place, which I think has some bearing on access and availability of witnesses and survivors. So in instances where we have decided not to undertake remote interviews, I just want to highlight 3 things. And the first is resources that are available to the mechanism. The second is the infrastructure required on the ground. And then thirdly is the human element or the human contact element. And I think both Mohamed and Erin have already alluded to this, but maybe I'll speak a little bit about these 3 things. So in terms of the resources and how this has impacted a decision, so maybe let me speak about these 3 things in how, in how they enable us or not enable us to do the face-to-face interviews. So with the resources, it would be the actual, and Erin has spoken about this, but what actually hinders your actual movement, so actually being able to access a place physically. So in most of in the context where I've worked, mostly things like just the weather and climate, so flooding that would prevent you from actually reaching people. The dynamics of the conflict, so whether fighting, etc., has spread to places where you might want to go and meet with people. And then, of course, both Mohamed and Erin have spoken about COVID and its actual impact on being able to reach a place. So though we have enjoyed access, the actual COVID restrictions mean you're not able to move perhaps from your base to reach where you would ordinarily find interlocutors and people you would meet with face to face. Around the infrastructure, I think one of the things that enables us when we do have access is, of course, going physically. But in terms of remote interviewing, it wouldn't be possible in the context where I've worked because just of the technology and communications infrastructure. So where it's absolutely, so it's not even, I think, going a little bit beyond what Erin said about whether a person's socioeconomic status enables them to have a phone or a computer or Wi-Fi access, but actually just this not being available generally. So it takes away that as an option almost altogether, because if there are no cell phone towers, if there is no Wi-Fi connectivity, it makes it incredibly difficult. And then I think also the infrastructure that the third parties or intermediaries would have access to enable you as a mechanism to do these some of these interviews remotely. And then just the ability to find your interviewees repeatedly. So of course, you know, the general approach has been to obtain as much as possible when you are able to meet face-to-face with interlocutors, with witnesses, with survivors, because of just the nature of the context, the movement of people, the difficulty of finding the same people in the same place again and again. So of course, if you were to try and do this remotely, this would be a really huge challenge. On the third area around the human contact element, and I think both Mohamed and Erin have spoken about this in various ways, I think the critical thing is around building trust. Working with communities, working in a context where people are highly traumatized, where the source of their fear or insecurity is constant, is on a daily basis. So not only the threat of your physical security, but also just uncertainty about what tomorrow will bring, your survival on a daily basis. And I think to then intervene in such a situation, you know, trying to have a remote interview is dealing with all of those dynamics which are happening at the same time. Erin has already referred to psychosocial support and the need for referral pathways. And again, as I say, in a context where very few services are available generally on a regular basis, then coming into the context such as one of you know, marked by violence and conflict, it then adds a more complicating dynamic to trying to do remote interviews. I think there's also the added dimension of, you know, where you're interacting and intervening in situations where multiple languages, so both spoken language, so whether it's English, you know, Arabic, etc., but also the language that we use in our investigations, which is quite technical, quite expert-based language, which we often are interpreting when we interact with survivors, with victims, with witnesses. But there's an added layer to that when you have language assistance, and not only in being able to read body language, read the cues, as Erin said, but also being able to translate and interpret the language of our investigations and documentation. So just quickly on the gaps, I think one of the gaps that you then have in not being able to do remote interviewing, I think, is time, especially because you have access physically to the location. Time then becomes a gap, and how to fill that gap of time. And I think one of the things has really been to make sure you're obtaining as much information from your immediate environment, and also through other sources, desktop research, etc. And then also just to say that remote interviewing is therefore, because of all the challenges I've mentioned, not necessarily out of the question. There would be some witnesses, some survivors, etc., who would be interviewed remotely, but those who you would be able to find, and those who would be able to have the infrastructure, the resources for you to engage with them remotely. So let me leave it at that and come back in the next round. Thank you.
Thank you, Shuvai. That's really helpful. And it's also helpful for us to hear about situations where people have not conducted remote investigations because all the preconditions haven't been present. When we've spoken to some investigators, they've spoke about feeling compelled to sort of fulfill a mandate or a mission or do, you know, donor request. And so interviewing witnesses, I guess, clouded their judgment as to whether it's actually appropriate to conduct the interview. And, you know, people really spoke about needing this culture where investigators can say no if they think it's physically or emotionally unsafe, or it's just, you know, too hard in the circumstances that you've described. I'm interested to talk more about this idea of resources and logistics and technology and security, which is what you touched on initially, Mohamed. I'd be interested to hear what you how you've sort of tailored your plans to witnesses facing different risks around security and technological challenges, and how you've managed to sort of circumvent them or not, and how you've addressed it.
Thank you, Daniela. Yeah, no, basically from my perspective, there are three main types of challenges. The first is, of course, the well-being of our interlocutors, and that concerns both security, physical security, as well as their psychosocial well-being. Of course, when considering remote interviews, these are the cardinal considerations that all investigators must make in conjunction with the team leader, with the security advisor, and the security advisor, of course, is usually informed through his conversations also with authorities, with other UN agencies, with communities, and a range of other players. The second consideration from an investigative perspective is one of credibility. So when we do remote interviews, first of all, it's difficult to ascertain the identity of the people that we meet with. It's difficult to know whether they are alone, for example, in the area where they are being interviewed, whether they are being influenced by somebody else, whether somebody is there suggesting responses, which has happened in the past. We could hear, whispers in the background, and one of quality, of course, of the information, because as Shuvai mentioned, when you do not carry out in-person interviews, there's a part of the communication that is lost, especially if it's not done by video. So there's all the non-verbal communication. There's problems frequently of connectivity. Therefore, we don't have a fluid conversation because it's constantly interrupted by technical problems, delays in the sound, interruptions in the line, etc. And also, as Shuvai and Erin mentioned, it compromises a little bit the possibility of developing trust with our interlocutors. For most of us working in this field, including commissions of inquiry, we don't have powers to summon people. We rely on people's willingness to engage with us and to talk to us. And the extent to which they will share information will very much depend on to what extent they trust us, to what extent they feel comfortable. And to establish that kind of environment, it's very difficult when you are doing it remotely, when there are problems of connectivity, etc. So how we go about trying to prevent or mitigate some of these limitations is, well, firstly, in terms of security, as we mentioned before, to make a general assessment of security. And if we can check that, then to make an individual assessment, whether that in particular individual is at an exceptional risk of retaliation. Secondly, it's to try and understand better the context in which they're in. So are they in a camp? If they're in a camp, that means they're surrounded by people. In a camp, often also people will tell you they can't trust anyone. There are some informants sometimes in camps or in areas where there's a high density of people. So we have to understand from what context are they engaging with us. Another issue, of course, is the selection of the platform. So, for example, in the 2014 Gaza conflict, the investigation relied a lot, because we did not get access to either the occupied Palestinian territories or Israel for, let's say, political reasons. So we relied a lot on UN colleagues, especially from the human rights in Gaza, in the West Bank, who were able to not only identify people on our behalf, because they were doing fact-finding of their own, but also to arrange for these people to come to the premises of the UN, from where it was possible to converse with them through a secured line. Similarly, in Yemen, in my second investigation in Yemen, which was shortly after the Houthi takeover of the capital, we were not given access, but the Human Rights Country Office had set up a monitoring team consisting mostly of national staff who were doing a fantastic job and who were able to arrange for witnesses to come to our premises and have secured kind of or more secured line of communication with us abroad. In other contexts, we try to bypass it by seeing whether or not we are able to, because we always have a budget, transport people to third countries, neighboring countries where it is deemed, more safe than where they, reside. And where we, have no other option but to do remote interviews without, the infrastructure of the UN, for example, we would then rely on other platforms, usually are encrypted from end to end. Usually they are advised to us by our colleagues who are experts in this field and who can inform us which platforms, which means are, let's say, less vulnerable to eavesdropping or intrusions, and which are not. In terms of providing psychosocial support, we also try to agree with, organizations, medical, healthcare organizations, to whom we can refer people that we would identify as suffering from potentially some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder or some kind of psychosocial disturbance as a result of the violations or abuses that they may have witnessed or suffered. When it comes to, for example, assessing the credibility of the information, we also try and put things in perspective. So we know if a person is engaging with us from, say, an area outside of Tripoli, just to give an example, they may be more comfortable talking about alleged violations committed by others and not the authorities that are in control there. But they may be more reluctant to share information about, for example, the presence of armed groups or the presence of possible military targets. So we have to factor that in. And we have to factor in also the fact that they may be compromised, and not possibly because they have their own political affiliations, but possibly because they may feel somewhat observed or threatened. So if we perceive that, for example, we would immediately, usually halt the interview. And in general, these are issues that we take into consideration when we establish the credibility of the source and of the information. I think in general, as Judge Kirby was mentioning at the beginning, we should not allow non-cooperation by states or other groups to obstacle the path of justice. But we must simply, I think, adhere to best practices and try to, always apply mitigating steps to try and prevent any kind of risk. And as you also rightly mentioned, there should not be any kind of pressure to carry out interviews that are deemed unsafe for one reason or another. I think that must be a cardinal kind of principle guiding all investigations. And I think also that in the case of, a lot of the countries where we work, I think there is an established track record now, when we look at the last 10, 15 years, of investigations that have successfully been completed despite non-cooperation by a government or other de facto authorities. So we are also trying to use that a lot in our lobbying activities. We are trying in our engagement to really get the message across that by denying us access or by not upholding your responsibility to protect individuals, you are also, firstly, not, blocking us from doing our work, from investigating, from gathering information. And secondly, you're usually denying yourself from the possibility of sharing your side of the story, of providing us information that can give us a more complete narrative. And I think that in addition to taking practical steps, such as protection and, improved technological platforms for carrying out remote interviews, I think simultaneously, NGOs, the United Nations, and also states who are concerned with human rights should also intensify the lobbying activities with those who are posing an obstacle to our access to people or places and who are not upholding their responsibility to protect individuals who come into contact with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohamed. One of the things you mentioned, which was also something that Mr. Kirby mentioned, was about not seeing non-cooperation of the state as an obstacle to actually conducting the investigation. And this is something that when Emily and I were discussing launching this project, we discussed a lot, because governments were often just trying to discredit UN fact-finding reports or NGO reports, even like our own work, by saying that you haven't been to the country, you haven't done investigations in country, and seeing that as a barrier. And so one of the ideas that we had was that by giving really transparent methodologies, you're saying, well, we've thought about these things, exactly what you're saying, the criteria or the different position someone's coming from when they're being interviewed, and as long as you're transparent about that and understand that and factor that into your analysis, then it shouldn't be a reason to discredit an investigation. But I wanted to just go back to what you said earlier, and I'll also tie in with one of the questions that were in the panel in the Q&A box for you, Erin, and it is more about sort of that idea of verifying who you're speaking to when you're conducting the actual interview, and how do you get consent from that person? How do you build rapport with them, build trust? Can you get informed consent when it's remote? What does all this mean, and how do you do it?
Yeah, good questions. First thing, I think, it is obviously very possible to do remote interviews and build rapport and get good information and evidence. So we all have been doing it, at different times for years. At the same time, I will argue there's no substitute for doing it in person and being in person and conducting these interviews as well. But yes, we're trying to strike that balance all the time in our work of being able to do the work and kind of getting the best quality and quantity of good information that we can. I think that it takes a little more time and patience doing it remotely, just to build the trust, as Shuvai and Mohamed have talked about, for the witness, victim, survivor to feel comfortable in the setting. There's certainly nothing very dynamic about sitting in front of a computer or a monitor or a phone. It's a very sterile setting. Certainly we present who we are, identification, even showing it. I like, on a personal note, like to show my surroundings, show them where I'm sitting, if I'm in an apartment or an office, what it looks like, also that they see there's nobody else here, letting them know this is, unless it is being tape recorded, that this is not being tape recorded, because that's an obvious assumption especially if you're doing it with computers or phones. But I find, taking that time to explain, why unfortunately we can't be there in person to talk with one another, what it means doing it like this with technology, that for sure there'll be some little glitches and we might lose each other. the frame might freeze or what have you, but that's okay. And we're all kind of figuring this out, you know, together, making it very kind of, you know, that we're both sharing this unusual experience, remote experience together. And I have found that it takes a little more time than I think it does in person before people have started to sort of relax and be comfortable with the setting, and obviously get to trust the interviewer. It's, I think, as we all know, it's tiring, it's fatiguing to sit in front of screens, whether, you know, large monitors or our phones. So to really factor in those breaks and those times to stand up and stretch and get water and what have you, you know, throughout. And you know, there may be really a triage approach that, you know, because it will take a little more time, you know, we have to prepare for our interviews either taking longer, or maybe there are things that we choose not to speak about or go into because there's just only so many, you know, so many hours someone can sit in front of a screen with you. As I mentioned, in terms of the rapport and missing cues, which I think is a little more dangerous when you're not, or possible when you're not in person. It's sometimes a little bit harder to read, and just to be very careful that we're not jumping to assumptions, and to check in frequently with the witness and, you know, how they're feeling, and you know, see what's working and not working. Yeah, as Mohamed mentioned, connectivity is so important. You hate to have somebody telling you the key most important part of their story and to have the frame freeze or to lose connection. So that can be a very, probably we've all experienced it, a very frustrating thing to have happen. And one thing I did want to mention before about sort of the visual aids, we might, you know, those of us that would be able to show documents or videos or photographs to people, you know, through videos or through the computers, that, you know, to be prepared ahead of time with that. It takes some time. It does take preparation. It does mean having it set up on your computer. It does mean having other parts of your computer not visible. So just to be careful with that. But I found that also works really well in interviews. I think it works better remotely actually than it does in person, because you can all see it in the same direction in front of you. You can walk through it, talk through it slowly. So it actually is very helpful. In fact, one of the pluses of doing it remotely. Yeah, and otherwise, I think that's, you know, really kind of mainly what I would say about the rapport is just taking the time. It's going to take as long as it takes, and it might be a little bit more with the remote interviews than in person. And otherwise, the interviews we do, you know, still all piece model interviews from beginning to end. You know, just because we're remote, the closing is not going to be any different. We're going to make sure that they have, you know, access to support that they need, you know, afterwards, as well as before and during.
Thank you, Erin. That's really helpful. And you have also answered some of the questions that were put in the box about building rapport with the witness and that issue of not having body language. One of the issues as well that came up there was around responding to witness distress. And Shuvai, I'm interested to hear more from you about, you know, how challenges of responding to witness distress feeds into your decisions about whether or not to do remote interviews, and particularly because that comment you made earlier, or the point you made about the resources on the ground, and whether there are actually places where you can refer people, you know, after the interview, and what sort of resources there are. So what sort of, I guess, services or referral pathways would you expect to see in place if you were going to be conducting an interview with somebody about sensitive subject matter?
Thanks, Daniela. And again, I'll try not to speak too much on things that both Mohamed and Erin have already covered. But I think one of the things for me that comes to mind when I think about this question is the source of witness distress. So often, I think we focus quite a bit on the witness distress that may come as a result of retelling or reliving through a traumatic event. But I think when we think beyond just what we may be engaging a witness on and think about other issues that may cause them distress, so whether someone is, Mohamed mentioned you might be accessing someone or speaking to someone who's living in a refugee settlement. So whether, they're hungry, whether their children are hungry, whether they're stressed about their children accessing education or other services in that place. So many different things that can influence the distress that our witnesses may be experiencing. Then I think the other thing is the relationship, I think, to that as people doing interviews for human rights purposes or international criminal investigations, etc., with people and those who provide services on a humanitarian basis, so first responders and other humanitarian actors, so those who are at the coalface of the daily experiences of some of our witnesses. And I think the expanding what that means in relation to our work. And I think both Mohamed and Erin have spoken about engaging with and interacting with some of those actors. But I think maybe spending more time investing in understanding the role that those actors play in the ecosystem that our witnesses live in on a day-to-day basis, and recalling that what we are coming to do is largely related to the past, right? But many of these individuals are still living and still experiencing life on a daily basis, where a lot of the humanitarian actors and our colleagues in this sector are interacting with them. And so how our work and our work that is touching on a piece of their lives, and granted a piece that is quite significant, but how that could benefit from from the day-to-day interaction and knowledge and expertise and understanding that the other actors in the ecosystem have and know and understand. And so I think for me, that is some of what I would expect to see, or even have an expectation on myself to leverage that understanding, that knowledge of how other actors are actually contributing to, and how some of the witnesses can rely on that. So whether it's about their day-to-day issues in relation to to food and education and healthcare and accessing healthcare, etc., and how this can therefore be one less issue that they're necessarily having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And then of course the psychosocial support. I mean, I think this is something that at least in the context where I have been working, is still a huge need. And I think some of the support, looking at some of the resources in the immediate context that might be able to play a role. So whether it's religious institutions, churches, mosques, etc., and as well as midwives, and some of what does exist in the context that could really be an immediate source of support or help in a referral pathway. So beyond sometimes a very a sophisticated sense of a referral pathway that we may have that includes psychologists or even psychiatrists, but really focusing on what is the resources available in the immediate context. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Daniela.
Thanks, Shuvai. That was incredibly informative. We seem to have covered most of the Q&A questions, and I'd really like to turn to Mr. Kirby and each of the panelists to get concluding remarks or sort of any final thoughts that you have that you wish to share with investigators with us today, tonight, wherever you are.
I start off by saying how tremendously impressed I have been with the contributions by Mohamed, Erin, and Shuvai. And I thought I'd thought through all of the issues of methodology, and I've learned a lot of extra ones tonight. We didn't, in the North Korea exercise, of course, had to consider the particular issue of COVID, because that preceded the advent of the pandemic. But going through my mind as I listened to the comments that have been made was a reminder of just a few features of the inquiry I took part in that may be of general significance. The first is to say that the United Nations is a wonderful institution. It's the hope of the world, and I praise it, and I'm very full of admiration for it, and very glad to hear Mr. Biden saying very nice things about it and multilateralism generally. But the fact is that the United Nations grew in 1945 and thereafter out of traditions, bureaucratic traditions, which are rather secretive. They are bureaucratic traditions of Britain at that time, with its empire and with its attitude towards official secrecy, and the French tradition, which is rather authoritarian. The problem with those two traditions is that they're not as transparent as the world now expects. That is something that has to be considered in both remote and person-to-person investigations. It's very important for us to keep our eye on the object of the whole exercise, which is not to produce a beautiful report, not to do what is objectively a wonderful investigation, but to get action and to get follow-up. And when the report of the Commission of Inquiry on North Korea hit the desks in the United Nations, it created a sensation. Now, why was that? I think it's because our methodology included utilizing the voices of those who had suffered. And if you look at our report, every page or every second page has a number of quotations from those who speak truth to power. And they're selected, they can say much more powerfully than a bureaucrat or a judge or somebody else can write. And I think that's a very important lesson that I took away from my inquiry. And in a way, it is now added to by the methodology that has become available through AVL links, that we have captured the voices and images of people. Please do not think that most witnesses don't want to speak. Many of them do want to speak. Many of them are keen to have their voice and to have it heard. They have to be protected from themselves sometimes, and we had to do that because families are still living in North Korea of the escapees from North Korea. But it is very important to utilize the voices and to utilize the recorded voices. I know it can't always be done, but we should get away from the secrecy and the methodology of the third person report into the directness and effectiveness of the voices of those who know most about the subject. And I think that is really one of the most important lessons I took away from the North Korea report. And if anything, it has been increased by the advent of Zoom and the new technology that can allow the voices to speak and to always be there and to continue speaking after the report has been finished, done and dusted. It's not over until there is transparency and until there is action.
Thank you very much. It really is inspiring and important to keep that at the center of what we're doing, because we are doing it for reasons, as you say. We're not doing it just for the sake of fact-finding. We're doing it for the sake of actually pushing action and also to give victims a voice. And I think that that also makes the concept of remote interviewing both exciting, but also really challenging, because we want to use that platform when we can't get access, but we also need to be really conscious of protecting people and not putting them at more risk. We'll continue for, Gabriel's just put an announcement, and we'll go until past, just so that we can hear concluding remarks from the panelists, and then Philip Trewhitt will make some concluding remarks as well on behalf of IICI. So Mohamed, do you have any final message you would like to share with people today?
Hi, thanks, Daniela, and thank you also to the other panelists. My final message is just that there are very specific challenges, security and other relating to remote interviewing, which means that we must refine our methodology and our assessment of situations before we engage in remote interviewing. Nonetheless, I think all investigations carry with them a measure of risk. We may interview people in the country and ask them to come, for example, to the UN premises. But then some people will tell you, actually, by visiting the premises, I could be identified and that could place me at risk. There are other contexts, especially where there are, situation of insecurity, where, for example, we have maybe the capacity to move and come in loco to meet someone or to visit a site. However, as you well know, we're not exactly transparent, when we move. We usually move with several, convoy of big vehicles, clearly marked. We're protected with armed personnel. We are a punch in the face sometimes, especially when we go into some remote areas. So that too can carry risks. So for me, I would not want to feed into, let's say, a possibly misleading narrative whereby we identify as, remote interviewing as the only risk. I think investigations always carry a risk, not only primarily to the victims and witnesses, not only to them, also to intermediaries, also to NGOs, also to national staff, and at times also to colleagues. So I think that Judge Kirby said it best when he said most witnesses want to speak, even when we are asking them, begging them not to speak because it may expose them to retaliation. Many of them, they would enter into an argument with us because they would rather have their voices heard, accepting the risks that it may entail. So I would absolutely conclude by, first of all, congratulating both the Institute for International Criminal Investigation as well as PIAC for these guidelines. And I think the way forward would be simply to refine our methodologies, share good practices, and make it so that victims and witnesses can continue to have their voices heard, rather than, let's say, put a blanket kind of, prohibition on this particular modality. I think we should just appreciate the challenges and find ways of overcoming them. And certainly over time, I think there will be a reversal of this restrictions imposed by authorities and other groups, because they will come to a conclusion that they have more to lose than to gain by blocking access, by being non-cooperative. Thank you again, and thank you to all the other panelists and the participants as well.
Thank you, Mohamed. Erin, it would be great to hear some concluding remarks from you as well.
Sure. Yeah, mine are along a similar vein of Judge Kirby and of Mohamed as well. I feel the theme is responsibility. We have the responsibility to give visibility to the crimes and to the victims and communities out there. At the same time, recognizing in a remote, world that we sometimes have to work in, that we may eliminate or miss out on some of those crimes or on some of those victims or communities too, because of the lack of access on either part, for us or for the communities. And part of our responsibility as investigators, documenters, interviewers is truly understanding the context of the victims, of the witnesses, of the communities. And though we are not there present with them, that doesn't absolve us of the responsibility of keeping them secure, of protecting their safety, both for the witnesses, for the survivors, intermediaries, civil society, and NGOs, interpreters, all that become involved in our, in our remote workings. And, we do that by, preparation, and awareness, and our own homework in truly understanding their context, their situation, and what we can or cannot do. So once again, I come back to it is really our responsibility to do this work, and especially the remote work, well and properly and safely for all those we are coming in contact with. Thank you all.
Thank you, Erin. I think that's also a really valuable point, because I think also one of the things that came out in a lot of the interviews we did with investigators is that people think there's a common misperception that remote interviewing is easier or quicker or isn't as costly or doesn't take as long. And all the investigators we spoke to were really adamant about the fact that it does take longer. And if you really take that on and take that idea of responsibility on seriously, then it does take time, because there are a lot of different things that you need to put in place to make sure that you're doing it safely and securely. So thank you for raising that point. Shuvai, I'll now turn to you for your final comments, and I feel bad that you're last every time, but I think you've got great comments, so it'd be good to hear what you have to say next.
Thank you, Daniela. No, I'm happy to go last and let the other fountains of wisdom lead the way. So I would just, first of all, just to say, Judge Kirby, I'm really excited to hear what your comments, and especially about the secretive and very, authoritarian almost history or inheritance that the UN has, and how we inadvertently put this into our own approaches in some of this work, especially if there are UN bodies that we have been mandated by or are working with and for. And just the reminder about whose voices it is that need to be heard. I think just to follow on from both Mohamed and Erin, I think for me, the first thing is that, and I appreciate as well these guidelines by both IICI and PIAC, is that they are very obviously living guidelines. They're not static, they're not absolute, they are really guidelines. And so there is a lot of room for dynamism, for change, and to respond to the context that we will find ourselves in. So today it's COVID, but tomorrow it may be something else completely. And like Mohamed is saying, tomorrow there may be, access into many of these places where there hasn't been access up to now. I think the biggest, or one of the other things for me is recognizing the ecosystem. Erin has called it context, but the ecosystem of the lives that we are intervening into, that our questioning, our desire for understanding, for knowledge, for information, for facts is really around a slice of time in a person's life. But there's so many other things going on constantly and continuously, and into this future where there may or may not be an accountability mechanism where we are intervening. And so how do we bring all those pieces together, including those of our colleagues in the humanitarian sector who also interact and intersect in this? So for me, I think my two quick things for us to think about as we continue to ponder remote interviewing is how we make the most of the resources at our disposal. So whether we do have very limited technological and communication resources, or we have a lot of them, how do we make the most of those resources? And secondly, to remember that we are creating and innovating. I think this is what has energized me from hearing from my fellow panelists and also Judge Kirby, is that we are in a place of innovating and creating. And so we need to really be on the lookout for the opportunities that exist to actually make this and do this better and learn from it, and and see what we make of it for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. They've all been extremely wise sort of insights that you've shared with us, and I'm very grateful to have heard it, having spent a lot of time working on the guide. I still feel like, and I'm sure IICI will agree, that, you know, we continue to learn and hear more from people like all of you. So thank you for so generously sharing with all of us. As most of the questions have been answered in the course of the discussion, I'll hand over now to Philip Trewhitt, the Executive Director of IICI, to make some concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Daniela. I'll be brief. My only role here really is to say a few thank yous. Firstly to PIAC, it's been sort of the first real collaboration, but it's been a very pleasurable one so far, and I hope we get to do some more in the future. So thanks, particularly Daniela and Emily, thank you to you. To everybody who contributed on our side, I want to say thank you, particularly John Ralston, who was my predecessor here at IICI, who did a lot of work to harmonize these two guidelines and make sure they were saying not necessarily exactly the same things, but at least we weren't ever contradicting each other, which is sort of important. And I want to thank my team as well, Gabriel and Kirsten, and particularly Gabriel, who's put his heart and soul into this. I think it's not always easy to create something short and usable. Sometimes it takes longer to create something short than it does to create something long, but it was a lengthy process, I can tell you, involving an awful lot of work. So thank you. And I congratulate Gabriel in particular on that one. I'm just going to add one comment to this from my perspective. It's not the intention of us to dictate as an organization how people do things. What we're trying to do here, I think, is really start a bit of a conversation. It's to maybe get people thinking a little bit more, because investigations can be a bit of an industrial process. I was an investigator for 17 years on quite a number of different types of investigation. And there's this concept of need and necessity. And really what we're often talking about is not urgent investigative necessity, it's a deadline. It's a key performance indicator. It's the boss is coming back. It's we've got to get a report out. It's the donor wants something. That is not an urgent investigative necessity. So all we're trying to do is get people to think a little bit about this. And the way I would couch it is a little bit with the other project we're doing, the Murad Code, is witnesses are not a commodity. They are not a resource. They are people. They are people just like we are. And all I would think is, if it was your mother, your son, your daughter, your brother, whoever it is on the other end of that internet, how much care would you want the investigator to be taking before they contacted them? And that's how much we would like people to, how much care we would like them to take. So the only comment I would leave you is, just because you can, it doesn't mean you should.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you as well for the thank yous to John Ralston and the other people who were involved in reviewing our guide, and my co-author Emily and Gabriel for working so closely with us on this. I want to thank our speakers and panelists for sharing your insights, and also to as I said, those practitioners who gave us all the examples, because I think it's hearing the different examples that helps people to really figure out how they're going to navigate the path of remote interviews and what is the safest and best options. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. We're really grateful to have had the opportunity to make this, to meet like this in a webinar format. But having said that, we really miss the in-person contact, the information that you pick up in breaks and the subtle cues you get from body language. And I think much like this session over webinar today, interviewing remotely is challenging, and it will never be preferred to conducting an interview in person where possible. Thank you, everyone.